It's strange how a single sentence can fracture an entire life. When my wife sat across from me one evening, eyes distant and tone rehearsed, she whispered the words that would mark the end of us. I need to find myself. At first, it sounded like something lifted from a movie or a book, almost too cliché to be real, but the sting it carried was nothing short of devastating. This wasn't just a confession. It was an ultimatum dressed as self-discovery. And as much as I wanted to laugh it off or tell her she already had everything she needed right here, I knew deep down that this was the moment everything shifted. Looking back, it wasn't the suddenness of her declaration that shocked me. It was how perfectly it summarized the months of subtle detachment, the conversations that went nowhere, the growing gap between us that I had tried so desperately to ignore. That one line became the headline of our downfall, and though I didn't know it then, I would help her find herself, but not beside me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Ethan Calloway, and for years, I thought I had everything figured out. I wasn't the richest man in town, nor the most adventurous, but I built a life that I believed was solid, reliable, and grounded in love. I grew up in a small town in Vermont, surrounded by quiet hills and maple forests that seemed to hold the kind of permanence I craved in life. That sense of stability became a part of me, shaping how I approached relationships, career, and family. I met my wife, Claire, during our second year of college. She was the kind of woman who lit up rooms without trying, her laughter infectious, her curiosity boundless. Where I sought routine, she sought experiences. Where I found comfort in predictability, she thrived in spontaneity. At first, we complemented each other in the best way, balancing out one another's edges. She taught me to take risks, to try things I wouldn't normally consider, while I gave her the kind of security she admitted she never had growing up. We dated for 4 years before marrying in a small ceremony by the lake near my parents' home. It was simple, heartfelt, and to me perfect. Our vows weren't grandiose, but they felt real, rooted in a promise to face life together. For a long time, I believed we were living up to that promise. I pursued a career in architecture, a field that allowed me to combine creativity with structure, and Claire worked in marketing, where her charm and adaptability made her stand out. We moved into a cozy house not far from where I grew up, and though it wasn't extravagant, it was ours. A place we painted together, furnished together, and filled with little reminders of our shared journey. Those early years of marriage were golden. We'd take spontaneous weekend trips, cook late-night meals in our tiny kitchen, and talk about the future like it was a story we were co-writing. Claire would sometimes dream aloud about traveling the world, seeing Paris or Tokyo, while I pictured us raising a family in the quiet comfort of Vermont. We didn't always agree on the details, but it felt like we were aligned in spirit, moving in the same direction even if we saw different paths. I thought that as long as love was at the core, everything else could be worked out. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. It started with her restlessness, the way she lingered on travel blogs or documentaries about people who had abandoned their lives to find freedom abroad. At first, I chalked it up to harmless daydreaming. Who hasn't fantasized about dropping everything and starting fresh somewhere else? But then the daydreams turned into late-night conversations where she'd wonder aloud if we had settled too early, if maybe we had skipped the part of life where people explore and discover themselves before committing. I tried to reassure her, telling her that we could still explore together, that marriage didn't mean the end of discovery. But each time, she'd respond with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, as though she knew something I didn't. I wasn't blind to the signs, though I wanted to be. The dinners where she seemed distracted, the growing silence in the car rides, the way her phone became more of a companion than I was. She had always been a social person, but now her circle expanded to include colleagues I had never met and friends who seemed to exist only online. Still, I convinced myself that it was a phase, that every couple goes through periods of disconnect and that our foundation was strong enough to endure. After all, hadn't we weathered challenges before? So when she finally said, "I need to find myself," it wasn't just a revelation, it was confirmation. All those little warning signs I had brushed aside came rushing back in one wave of painful clarity. I remember sitting there, the weight of her words pressing down on me, trying to understand what she was really saying. Did she mean she wanted space? Time apart? Or was this the gentle way of telling me she no longer wanted to be married? I asked her what finding herself meant, and her answer was a muddle of vague aspirations: travel, independence, self-discovery. She insisted it wasn't about me, that I hadn't done anything wrong, but that was almost harder to swallow. If I wasn't the problem, then I couldn't be the solution either. She was carving out a path that didn't include me, and my role, it seemed, was to step aside. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room staring at the framed photos of us lining the mantel. Smiling faces, vacations, holidays, family gatherings. All snapshots of a life I thought was secure. Now they felt like relics of something fragile. An illusion that had quietly dissolved while I was too busy holding on to the idea of permanence. What haunted me most wasn't just the fear of losing her, but the realization that maybe she had never truly been mine to hold on to. And as painful as it was to admit, the journey she wanted to take would be one I couldn't walk beside her on. What I didn't know then was that in helping her find herself, I would discover something too, not about her, but about the strength and clarity I didn't realize I had. Before I tell you how everything unraveled, you have to understand the kind of man I was and the life I thought I had built. My name is Ethan Calloway, and I wasn't someone who believed in shortcuts or reckless leaps. My upbringing taught me the value of patience, responsibility, and steadiness. My father, Harold, worked in construction, a man whose hands were always worn but whose eyes carried a sense of pride for every house he built. My mother, Ellen, was a school librarian, a gentle presence who filled our home with stories and a quiet strength that I only came to appreciate much later in life. Growing up in a small Vermont town meant that life was predictable in the best ways. Neighbors who waved from their porches, seasonal fairs where the whole community gathered, and long drives through roads framed by fiery autumn leaves. For some people, small-town life might feel suffocating, but for me it was grounding. I always thought I would create something just as steady for myself, and for a long time I believed I had done exactly that. I was never the star athlete or the most popular kid, but I was reliable. Friends came to me when they needed advice, teachers praised my consistency, and my parents trusted me in ways they didn't trust my more adventurous younger brother, Liam. I learned early that being steady earned respect, even if it didn't always draw attention. That became a part of my identity, almost like armor. When life felt uncertain, I leaned on routine, order, and the knowledge that if I did things right, good things would come. That's why when I met Claire in college, it felt like fate had rewarded me with someone who complemented that part of me. She was everything I wasn't: adventurous, spontaneous, endlessly curious about the world. She could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with 5 new friends, while I was the type who preferred one meaningful conversation to a dozen surface-level ones. We didn't make sense on paper, but together, it just worked. I grounded her, and she lifted me. That balance became the story I told myself over and over again. We were 2 halves of a whole, and no matter how different we were, together we made sense. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After graduation, while most of our peers scattered to big cities chasing opportunities, Claire and I made the deliberate choice to stay in Vermont. I landed a position at a mid-sized architecture firm, one that specialized in restoring historic buildings and designing sustainable homes. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. I loved sketching designs, overseeing projects, and most of all, knowing that what I created would stand for decades, maybe longer. Claire, with her degree in communications, started working at a regional marketing agency. She thrived in that environment, constantly juggling campaigns, brainstorming ideas, and charming clients with her energy. I watched her grow into someone even more confident than the woman I had first fallen in love with, and I couldn't have been prouder. Our first home was modest, a 2-bedroom colonial-style house with peeling paint and a creaky staircase. But to us, it was a palace. We poured ourselves into it. Weekends were spent repainting walls, fixing up the kitchen, and planting a small garden out back. Every improvement, every little detail we added, felt like we were carving out a future together. I remember standing with her on the porch one evening, looking at the sunset stretch across the sky, and she said, "This is just the beginning, Ethan. Think about everything we'll do together." At that moment, I believed her without a single doubt. Our marriage began with rhythms that felt natural. Claire was always the one suggesting new things. Day trips to nearby towns, spontaneous camping weekends, cooking classes. And I was always the one making sure we balanced the budget, scheduled time for family, and kept our responsibilities in check. I didn't resent this balance. I cherished it. I thought it was the perfect blend of freedom and security. I wasn't blind to her restless energy, but I took it as part of her charm. I thought as long as I gave her room to breathe and encouraged her passions, she'd always circle back home, back to me. To outsiders, we looked like the ideal couple. My colleagues envied the way I spoke about her, the way I lit up when describing our adventures. Claire's friends often told her she was lucky to have a husband who was so supportive, so steady, when many of their partners weren't. We went to weddings, holidays, family gatherings, always side by side, always smiling. People saw us as the couple who had figured it out early, who had skipped the messy years of dating and uncertainty and jumped straight into a life built on love and stability. And I believed it too. I believed that we had cracked the code. But even then, if I'm honest, there were cracks. I can see them now, but at the time, I explained them away. Claire sometimes complained that our life was too predictable, that we weren't taking enough risks or traveling enough. She'd get restless at parties when conversations turned toward people who were backpacking through Europe or moving to big cities. I would reassure her that our time would come, that we just needed to build a strong foundation first. Adventure can wait, I'd tell her, but building something lasting takes time. She'd nod, smile, even agree, but later I'd catch her staring at her phone, scrolling through pictures of places far from our quiet Vermont town. Still, I never imagined those restless sparks would grow into flames that could burn everything down. Back then, I thought we were untouchable. I thought our love was stronger than her longing for something undefined. That's why her words, "I need to find myself," cut so deep. Because for years, I believed we had already found ourselves in each other. I had built my life around that belief, around her, around us. And in the story I told myself there was no room for endings. Only continuations. What I didn't realize was that, while I saw us as settled and secure, she saw us as stuck. And though I thought I was giving her stability, she was beginning to see it as confinement. The truth is, Claire's search for herself didn't begin the night she spoke those words. It had been quietly brewing beneath the surface long before. When I think back to the beginning, before marriage and houses and responsibilities tied us down, it feels almost like a different lifetime, one painted in colors brighter than reality could ever sustain. I first met Claire on an autumn afternoon during my sophomore year at the University of Vermont. I was walking out of the architecture studio, arms full of sketchbooks, when I collided with someone carrying an armful of flyers for a student volunteer program. Papers scattered across the hallway, my drawings mixing with her flyers, and we both knelt down at the same time, reaching for the mess we'd created. She laughed, not a nervous laugh, but a full, unapologetic one, like even small inconveniences amused her. That laugh was the first thing that pulled me in. While I was trying to apologize, flustered and embarrassed, she simply grinned and said, "Well, at least your buildings look better than my flyer designs." That was Claire, turning what could have been frustration into a moment of connection. She invited me to join the volunteer program she was promoting, one that paired college students with local community projects, and against my usual instincts to avoid the spotlight, I agreed. That decision changed the trajectory of my life. For weeks, I found myself side by side with Claire, painting community center walls, organizing food drives, and even building garden boxes for a local school. What stood out to me wasn't just her boundless energy, but how she carried everyone along with her, as if her optimism was contagious. People followed her lead without hesitation, and I, someone who usually preferred to blend into the background, felt drawn out of my shell by her presence. We began as friends, though even then there was an undercurrent of something stronger. She teased me about my meticulousness, how I measured every cut of wood twice while building the garden boxes, while I'd roll my eyes at her tendency to jump into tasks without a plan. Yet we both admired what the other lacked. I admired her spontaneity, her courage to simply do without fear of making mistakes, while she admired my patience and attention to detail. Soon, we were grabbing coffee after volunteer shifts, walking through campus at night, sharing stories of our childhoods, and slipping into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The night I realized I was falling in love with her, we were sitting by Lake Champlain, wrapped in sweaters against the crisp October wind. She was telling me about her dream of traveling the world, her voice full of longing, painting pictures of cities I had never seen. I listened quietly, not because I didn't have dreams of my own, but because hearing hers made me want to be part of them. When she finally turned the question back to me, "What about you, Ethan? What's your dream?" I hesitated, then said simply, "To build something that lasts." At the time, I meant it literally: houses, buildings, structures that would endure. But now I realize I also meant us. Our relationship deepened quickly after that. By junior year, we were inseparable. Friends joked that we were the old married couple on campus, always cooking meals together in the dorm kitchen or studying late side by side. While others bounced between casual relationships, we were steady, rooted in a connection that felt rare for our age. It wasn't just infatuation, it was partnership. She believed in me, often more than I believed in myself, and I provided her with the kind of stability she craved in moments when her adventurous spirit left her uncertain. The first summer we spent together away from campus was a turning point. I took a part-time internship at a small architecture firm in town, and Claire stayed nearby, working for a local nonprofit. We rented a tiny apartment with paper-thin walls and a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, but to us, it was paradise. We filled it with mismatched furniture from thrift stores, cooked meals on a single pan, and spent evenings sprawled on the floor talking about our future. Those were the days when love was simple, unburdened by the weight of expectations. She would read me passages from travel books, and I would sketch imaginary houses I dreamed of building one day, and in our youthful optimism, it felt like all of it was possible. Looking back, it's clear that those early years were when the seeds of our differences were already being planted, though I couldn't see it at the time. Claire wanted movement, variety, the thrill of chasing horizons, while I wanted permanence, roots, something solid. But back then, those differences didn't feel like obstacles. They felt like the magic of our connection. I told myself that with time, we would find a middle ground. I believed that love alone was strong enough to bridge any gap. By the time senior year arrived, I was sure Claire was the woman I wanted to marry. She had become more than just my girlfriend. She was my anchor and my compass, the one who made life feel richer and fuller. On graduation day, as we tossed our caps into the air, I looked at her and thought, this is it. This is the person I will build my life with. Not long after, I proposed by the same lake, where we had shared so many late-night talks. It wasn't elaborate, just the 2 of us, a simple ring and words from the heart. She cried, said yes without hesitation, and in that moment, the future felt bright and certain. If there were warning signs back then, I didn't recognize them for what they were. I thought her longing glances at travel magazines were harmless curiosities. I thought her restlessness during long stretches of routine was just her energetic nature. I didn't realize that the same qualities I loved most about her, the spontaneity, the hunger for newness, were also the very things that could one day drive her away. To me, those early years were the perfect beginning to a lifelong story. And if someone had told me back then that one day she would sit across from me and say she needed to find herself, I would have laughed. Because in those days, I truly believed she had already found herself, with me. Our early married years became a season of golden days that I still carry in my memory, even though they now feel like artifacts from another life. When Claire and I stood before family and friends exchanging vows, I believed we were stepping into a life that could only expand in love and joy. Our wedding was simple, held outdoors by Lake Elmore, where the water reflected the blue sky and the trees swayed in a gentle summer breeze. Claire wore a modest lace dress that she insisted on choosing herself rather than listening to advice from bridal magazines, and I wore a suit borrowed from my older cousin because I couldn't justify spending money we didn't have yet. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way she looked at me as she said, "I promise to grow with you." Those words burned themselves into my memory, and for years afterward, whenever I doubted myself, I recalled the sincerity in her voice that day. After the wedding, we settled into our first real home together. It wasn't anything grand, just that small colonial house outside of town with squeaky floorboards and a drafty attic. But it became our canvas for creating a life. We spent weekends painting walls in colors that reflected our personalities. Her choosing bold hues like teal and mustard, me preferring calm shades of gray and cream, and somehow blending them into something that worked. We planted wildflowers in the front yard, hung fairy lights along the porch, and filled the inside with souvenirs from little adventures we took. There was the ceramic bowl she bought at a local craft fair, the postcards I collected from short business trips, and the mismatched coffee mugs we picked up at yard sales. Every corner carried a piece of us, stitched together into a home that radiated comfort and laughter. Claire brought spontaneity into that house. I still remember the night she decided at 11 p.m. that we should bake a cake, just because. We had no frosting, so she improvised with melted chocolate chips and leftover strawberries, laughing as she smeared it across the cake with a spoon. We stayed up past midnight, eating messy slices at the kitchen counter, our faces sticky with chocolate, our hearts so full, it felt impossible that anything could ever change. Those moments weren't spectacular or extravagant, but they became the glue that held us together. The little rituals, the shared silliness, the feeling that we were building something uniquely ours. We traveled when we could, though never as far as Claire dreamed. Weekend road trips became our specialty. We drove through winding mountain roads in New Hampshire, camped under the stars in Maine, and once spent 3 nights in a bed and breakfast along the Massachusetts coast where we walked the beach until our feet ached. Claire always made those trips feel like grand adventures, even when they were modest by most standards. She'd pull me into souvenir shops to try on ridiculous hats, drag me to small-town diners where the menus hadn't changed in 50 years, and insist we take 100 photos of every sunset. I wasn't naturally inclined to document life in that way, but her enthusiasm rubbed off on me. Slowly, I learned to see the beauty in the small things, to treasure experiences as much as accomplishments. At home, we built routines that made our marriage feel steady. Sunday mornings became sacred. Coffee brewing, pancakes on the stove, music playing in the background as we moved around the kitchen in easy rhythm. She'd flip pancakes with reckless abandon, often splattering batter across the counter, while I carefully stacked the finished ones in neat piles. We laughed about our differences, turning them into running jokes rather than points of tension. She teased me for being overly cautious, and I teased her for being reckless, but beneath the banter was a deep respect for the qualities we each brought to our marriage. I admired her zest for life, the way she could turn a dull evening into an adventure, while she told me she admired my consistency, my ability to create stability in a world that often felt uncertain. We talked often about the future during those years, and our visions, though not identical, felt compatible enough. Claire spoke about wanting to travel more once we had saved enough money, maybe even living abroad for a year if the opportunity arose. I spoke about wanting to design and build our dream home one day, a place where we could raise children and grow old together. We didn't always align on the details, but I believed compromise would bridge any gap. "We'll figure it out together," I'd say, and she'd smile, resting her head against my shoulder as if she believed it too. Family gatherings during this time reinforced the image of us as the perfect couple. My parents adored Claire, charmed by her warmth and curiosity. She could sit with my father and talk about woodworking projects, or spend hours with my mother helping in the garden. My younger brother Liam once told me that I had hit the jackpot, and that he hoped to find someone even half as vibrant as Claire. Friends admired how we seemed so connected, so content, and though I never said it out loud, I took pride in the way others saw us. It felt like confirmation that I had chosen well, that the life I had built with Claire was something worth envying. The happiest memories from those years aren't tied to grand milestones, but to small, intimate details. The way she'd hum to herself while folding laundry. The evenings we spent playing board games at the kitchen table, both fiercely competitive and laughing so hard tears rolled down our cheeks. The summer nights we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching fireflies flicker across the yard. Those ordinary moments, woven together, became extraordinary in their consistency. They convinced me that our love was unshakable, that we had created a bond that could weather any storm. If someone had asked me then to describe our marriage, I would have said it was happy, fulfilling, even inspiring. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface, Didn't recognize that the same restlessness that once charmed me could also turn into dissatisfaction. To me, the good times were proof that we were exactly where we needed to be. I believed wholeheartedly that our story was one of growth and enduring love. And that belief blinded me, because it made me ignore the whispers of doubt, the subtle shifts in Claire's gaze, the way her laughter sometimes carried a shadow of longing. For me, those years remain both the most beautiful and the most painful to recall, because they remind me of everything we had and everything I would eventually lose. Looking back, the first warning signs weren't dramatic explosions or obvious betrayals. They were subtle, creeping shifts that slid quietly into our lives until they became impossible to ignore. At the time, I dismissed them as quirks of routine, natural changes that come with years of marriage, but in hindsight, they were alarm bells ringing steadily, trying to wake me up to the reality I didn't want to see. The first real shift began with her silences. Claire had always been expressive, the kind of person who filled a room with her voice, her laughter, her opinions. But slowly, I noticed gaps. Moments when I'd come home from work eager to share something that had happened, only to find her distracted, her responses short and clipped, her eyes somewhere far away. "Just tired," she'd say when I asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. At first I believed her, because we all get tired, don't we? But the silences grew heavier, more frequent, until I realized they weren't about exhaustion. They were about absence, her being present in body but already drifting elsewhere in spirit. Another sign emerged in the way she began rearranging her schedule. Claire had always been spontaneous, yes, but she had also been deliberate about making time for us. Our Sunday mornings, once sacred, became negotiable. I'd wake to the smell of coffee, only to find a note on the counter. "Went for a walk, needed to clear my head." Or she'd announce abruptly on Saturday evening that she was joining a yoga retreat in a nearby town, leaving me to spend the weekend alone. I wanted to support her, of course. I admired her independence, her desire to explore new things, but gradually it began to feel less like she was including me in her growth, and more like she was carving out a life where I no longer fit. We talked often about the future during those years, and our visions, though not identical, felt compatible enough. Claire spoke about wanting to travel more once we had saved enough money, maybe even living abroad for a year if the opportunity arose. I spoke about wanting to design and build our dream home one day, a place where we could raise children and grow old together. We didn't always align on the details, but I believed compromise would bridge any gap. "We'll figure it out together," I'd say, and she'd smile, resting her head against my shoulder as if she believed it too. Family gatherings during this time reinforced the image of us as the perfect couple. My parents adored Claire, charmed by her warmth and curiosity. She could sit with my father and talk about woodworking projects, or spend hours with my mother helping in the garden. My younger brother Liam once told me that I had hit the jackpot, and that he hoped to find someone even half as vibrant as Claire. Friends admired how we seemed so connected, so content, and though I never said it out loud, I took pride in the way others saw us. It felt like confirmation that I had chosen well, that the life I had built with Claire was something worth envying. The happiest memories from those years aren't tied to grand milestones, but to small, intimate details. The way she'd hum to herself while folding laundry. The evenings we spent playing board games at the kitchen table, both fiercely competitive and laughing so hard tears rolled down our cheeks. The summer nights we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching fireflies flicker across the yard. Those ordinary moments, woven together, became extraordinary in their consistency. They convinced me that our love was unshakable, that we had created a bond that could weather any storm. If someone had asked me then to describe our marriage, I would have said it was happy, fulfilling, even inspiring. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface, didn't recognize that the same restlessness that once charmed me could also turn into dissatisfaction. To me, the good times were proof that we were exactly where we needed to be. I believed wholeheartedly that our story was one of growth and enduring love. And that belief blinded me, because it made me ignore the whispers of doubt, the subtle shifts in Claire's gaze, the way her laughter sometimes carried a shadow of longing. For me, those years remain both the most beautiful and the most painful to recall, because they remind me of everything we had and everything I would eventually lose. Looking back, the first warning signs weren't dramatic explosions or obvious betrayals. They were subtle, creeping shifts that slid quietly into our lives until they became impossible to ignore. At the time, I dismissed them as quirks of routine, natural changes that come with years of marriage, but in hindsight, they were alarm bells ringing steadily, trying to wake me up to the reality I didn't want to see. The first real shift began with her silences. Claire had always been expressive, the kind of person who filled a room with her voice, her laughter, her opinions. But slowly, I noticed gaps. Moments when I'd come home from work eager to share something that had happened, only to find her distracted, her responses short and clipped, her eyes somewhere far away. "Just tired," she'd say when I asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. At first I believed her, because we all get tired, don't we? But the silences grew heavier, more frequent, until I realized they weren't about exhaustion. They were about absence, her being present in body but already drifting elsewhere in spirit. Another sign emerged in the way she began rearranging her schedule. Claire had always been spontaneous, yes, but she had also been deliberate about making time for us. Our Sunday mornings, once sacred, became negotiable. I'd wake to the smell of coffee, only to find a note on the counter. "Went for a walk, needed to clear my head." Or she'd announce abruptly on Saturday evening that she was joining a yoga retreat in a nearby town, leaving me to spend the weekend alone. I wanted to support her, of course. I admired her independence, her desire to explore new things, but gradually it began to feel less like she was including me in her growth, and more like she was carving out a life where I no longer fit. Then came the shift in our conversations. Where we once spoke about dreams and plans, our talks became shallow, transactional. We discussed bills, schedules, grocery lists, but the deeper currents dried up. When I asked about her day, she'd answer vaguely, "Oh, the usual." When I asked how she was feeling, she'd shrug. "Fine." It was as though an invisible wall had gone up, and every attempt I made to scale it left me more frustrated. One night, as we lay in bed, I tried to bring it up. "Claire, are you happy?" I asked quietly in the dark. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought she might open up. But then she whispered, "I'm just figuring things out," before turning onto her side, her back to me. Those words lingered, a faint echo that gnawed at me in the silence of the night. I noticed other, smaller details too, things that seemed trivial at first, but added up to something unsettling. She stopped humming while folding laundry, a habit I had always associated with her contentment. She began spending more time on her phone, guarding it with an unusual vigilance, quickly flipping it over when I entered the room. She changed her style slightly, buying clothes that felt less like her and more like she was trying to embody someone new. At first, I told myself these were normal evolutions. Everyone changes. But deep down, I felt the ground shifting beneath us, as if the woman I knew was being replaced by someone I couldn't quite recognize. The distance became more obvious in social settings. At family gatherings, Claire, who had once been so engaged, started withdrawing. She'd sit quietly while others laughed and talked, her smile polite but thin, as though she was physically present but mentally absent. My mother noticed it first, asking me after one dinner, "Is Claire okay? She doesn't seem herself." I brushed it off, insisting she was just stressed with work, but inside I felt a pang of dread. Because I had noticed too. It wasn't just her being tired or distracted. It was her detaching, slowly but surely, from the life we had built. The first real confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, an ordinary night that turned extraordinary in its weight. I had made dinner, hoping to recreate one of our old traditions with pasta and a bottle of red wine. Claire sat across from me, pushing food around her plate. Finally, I asked, "Claire, is something wrong between us?" She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. Fear, sadness, maybe even guilt. "I don't know," she said finally. "Sometimes I just feel stuck." The word hit me like a hammer. Stuck. As if our marriage, our home, Our shared history were some kind of trap. I tried to keep my voice calm, asking, "What do you mean?" But she shook her head, refusing to elaborate, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. From that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. I tried harder, planning dates, initiating conversations, surprising her with small gestures. I booked a weekend trip to Vermont, thinking maybe a change of scenery would rekindle something between us. For a brief moment, it worked. We laughed again, hiked trails, shared coffee and bed. But as soon as we returned home, the old distance slipped back into place, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. It dawned on me then that this wasn't about needing more romance or excitement. Something deeper was unraveling, something I couldn't fix with gestures or trips. One night, after another unsuccessful attempt to talk, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my chest heavy with dread. I thought about the vows we had made, about the promise she whispered at our wedding. "I promise to grow with you." And I realized, with a hollow ache, that maybe she was growing, but away from me, not with me. The warning signs were no longer subtle. They were flashing bright and painful. I just didn't want to admit what they meant. The months that followed were marked by a tension I could never quite escape, a heaviness that clung to the air in our home. What had begun as subtle shifts now grew sharper, harder to ignore, and every attempt I made to pull Claire closer seemed only to push her further away. The silence between us was no longer occasional. It became the rule rather than the exception. Meals passed with only the sound of clinking silverware. Car rides turned into long stretches of unspoken thoughts. Even when we sat together on the couch, the distance was palpable, as if an invisible wall had been built brick by brick right between us. It was around this time that she first uttered the phrase that would echo in my mind for months to come. We were standing in the kitchen after another tense evening, and she looked at me with a mix of frustration and detachment. "I think I just need to find myself," she said, her voice low but firm. "I feel like I've lost who I am, and I can't do that anymore." The words landed like a bomb. I wanted to ask, why do you need to find yourself away from me? Haven't we been building this life together? But the lump in my throat kept me silent. All I could do was nod weakly as she turned away, leaving me standing alone with her words hanging in the air like smoke. From that point on, everything changed. Her statement wasn't just a passing comment. It became the mantra of her actions. Every choice she made, every distance she created, was framed by this need to find herself. And while I tried desperately to support her, to believe this was a phase we could navigate, deep down I feared the truth. Her journey of self-discovery might not include me at all. When you're in the middle of a storm, it's hard to know if you're imagining the thunder or if the sky is truly falling. That's how I felt in those weeks after Claire first told me she needed to find herself. I questioned whether I was overreacting, whether the coldness, the distance, the late nights, the secrecy were as bad as I thought. A part of me wanted desperately to believe this was all just a passing phase, that if I waited patiently and loved her enough, she'd come back to me. But it was the people around me, the ones who saw us from the outside, who forced me to confront the truth I was too afraid to face. The first conversation happened with my younger brother, Liam. He'd always been observant, and though he rarely intruded on my personal life, he showed up at my house one Saturday afternoon with a six-pack of beer, and that concerned look on his face that I knew meant he had something on his mind. We sat out on the porch, sipping in silence for a while, before he finally asked, "You and Claire doing all right?" I tried to play it off, saying she was just stressed, but he wasn't buying it. "Come on, man, I've seen you two for years. She looks at you different now. Like she's already somewhere else." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to defend her, to say he was misreading things, but the truth was I had noticed the same thing. Hearing him say it out loud was like having my worst fears dragged into the sunlight. A week later, I confided in my mother. She and Claire had always been close, and I thought maybe she could offer insight I couldn't see. We were sitting in her kitchen, the scent of fresh bread filling the air, when I asked, "Mom, do you think Claire seems different?" My mother's eyes softened with a kind of pity I hated to see. "Honey," she said gently, "I love Claire, but yes, I've noticed. She seems distant. Like she's carrying something she's not sharing with you. I don't want to interfere, but I don't want you to keep doubting what you already know." Her words were meant to comfort, but instead, they unsettled me. Because deep down I did already know. I just didn't want to admit it. Even my best friend Marcus weighed in. He and I had been friends since college, and he had always been the blunt one. One evening at a bar, after I'd vented about Claire's late nights and her constant refrain about needing space, Marcus leaned across the table and said, "Look, man, I'm just gonna say it. She's checked out. Whether it's another guy or she's just done with the marriage, I don't know, but she's not in this with you anymore." I wanted to punch him for saying it, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the sting of truth in his voice. Marcus had no reason to sugarcoat things, and his honesty forced me to confront the possibility that Claire's journey to find herself might already have left me behind. The validation from others should have brought clarity, but instead, it deepened my turmoil. I oscillated between anger at Claire for pulling away, guilt for possibly failing her in ways I couldn't see, and denial that this was happening at all. One night, after another tense dinner, I called Olivia, the same friend who had noticed our quietness months earlier. I poured everything out: Claire's absences, the secrecy, her coldness. Olivia listened patiently before saying, "You know, sometimes people convince themselves they need to leave to grow, but really they're just running away from the hard parts. It's not your fault she's choosing distance instead of communication." That perspective struck me differently. For weeks I had been wondering what I had done wrong, but Olivia's words reframed it. Maybe this wasn't about me failing. Maybe this was about Claire's unwillingness to fight for what we had. Still, even with all this outside validation, I wrestled with doubt. It's strange how love can blind you to the obvious. I kept hoping that if I gave her space, if I showed her patience, if I supported her self-discovery, she'd come back and remember the life we had built together. But every conversation with friends and family painted the same picture. She wasn't just exploring herself, she was pulling away from me, and that realization broke something inside me. The hardest moment came when Liam visited again. We were watching a football game in silence, neither of us really paying attention, when he suddenly said, "I hate seeing you like this. You're shrinking, man. This isn't you. You've always been steady, grounded. But now, it's like you're waiting for her to decide if you're worth it. And that's not right." His voice cracked a little as he spoke, and I realized how much my pain was spilling onto the people around me. I wasn't just losing Claire, I was losing myself in the process. That night, after everyone's voices replayed in my head, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and admitted something I had avoided for too long. I wasn't imagining this. Claire was drifting away, and no amount of waiting, supporting, or compromising was going to change that. The people who loved me most could see it clearly, and if they could see it, why couldn't I? The truth was simple, though brutal. Claire's words about finding herself weren't just about needing a little breathing room. They were a declaration that she no longer saw herself in the life we had built together. And even though I still clung to hope, I couldn't deny the validation from those around me. The signs weren't in my head. They were real, and they were leading us toward an inevitable breaking point. There is a moment in every unraveling where the truth crashes down with such force that you can no longer pretend, no longer cling to illusions or excuses. For me, that moment came on an unremarkable Thursday night, when the last threads of denial were ripped away, leaving only the raw clarity that everything I had been holding on to was gone. I came home from work to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table, her suitcase by her side. She wasn't crying, she wasn't angry. She looked calm, almost eerily so, as if she had already rehearsed this scene in her mind 100 times. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Those words, once so ordinary, carried a finality that made my stomach twist. I sat down across from her, my eyes darting to the suitcase, then back to her face. "Are you leaving?" I asked, my voice thin and strained. She nodded slowly. "I think it's time. I need to figure out who I am without all of this." She gestured vaguely to the house around us, as if our life, our memories, our vows were nothing more than clutter she needed to sweep away. My chest tightened as her words sank in. For weeks, I had sensed this was coming, but hearing her say it broke something inside me that I hadn't realized was still intact. "Claire," I whispered, leaning forward, searching her eyes for some trace of the woman I had once known. "We built a life together. We promised each other we'd grow together. How can you just walk away from that?" For the first time, her calm exterior cracked. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "I don't know how to explain it. I just feel like I've lost myself. Every day I wake up and feel like I'm living someone else's life. I don't hate you, Jacob, but I can't stay here and keep pretending. Her words weren't cruel, but they cut sharper than any blade. She didn't hate me, yet somehow that made it worse. It wasn't anger that was ending us. It was indifference. I felt a mix of panic and rage rise inside me. So that's it? After everything? After years of building this, you just pack a suitcase and walk away because you're bored? Because you think you need to go find yourself? My voice cracked on the last words, betraying the desperation I was trying to mask. Claire flinched but didn't argue. She simply said, "I'm sorry," and those two words rang hollow, like an apology for forgetting to return a borrowed book, not for tearing apart a marriage. That night was the longest of my life. She stayed in the guest room, her suitcase beside the bed, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every memory, every moment, every possible mistake that might have brought us here. By dawn, I was hollowed out, my body heavy with exhaustion but my mind sharp with the clarity I had been avoiding. Claire wasn't mine to save anymore. She had made her choice, and no amount of pleading, no number of compromises could change that. The woman who had once promised to grow with me had already grown away from me, and now she was choosing to finish that journey without me by her side. The next morning, I watched her carry her suitcase to the car. The sound of the trunk closing echoed through the driveway like a gavel striking, final and merciless. She turned to me, her eyes soft but distant. "Please take care of yourself, Jacob," she said. I wanted to scream, to demand how she could say those words while leaving me behind, but instead, I stood frozen, my throat locked, my hands clenched at my sides. Then she got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. The red taillights disappeared down the street, and with them went the future I had once believed was certain. The silence that followed was unbearable. I walked back into the house, every room echoing with her absence. The mug she had left on the counter, half full of cold coffee, felt like a cruel reminder of how quickly someone could abandon a life. I sat down on the couch, staring at nothing, the weight of the emptiness pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. For hours I sat there in shock, my mind replaying her words on a loop. I need to find myself. What did that even mean? And why did finding herself require destroying us? Over the next few days, reality sank in with brutal clarity. Friends called, family checked in, but I found myself withdrawing, unable to explain the depth of the loss I felt. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the death of a version of myself that had believed in us, that had believed love could overcome anything. The pain was raw, relentless, and no amount of comfort from others could dull it. At night, I lay in the empty bed, reaching instinctively for the space where she used to be, only to find cold sheets and silence. That was when it hit me hardest. She was truly gone, and she wasn't coming back. The rock-bottom moment wasn't just her leaving, it was the realization that I had been living in denial for months, maybe years, refusing to see what was right in front of me. All the warning signs, all the silences, all the absences had pointed to this, and yet I had clung to the hope that love would be enough. But love alone couldn't hold together a marriage when one person had already walked away in their heart. Claire didn't leave suddenly. She had been leaving piece by piece, and I had simply ignored it until there was nothing left. Sitting alone in that house, surrounded by the ghosts of our good times, I finally accepted the truth. She wasn't lost. She had simply chosen a path that no longer included me, and as much as it shattered me, I realized I had a choice too. I could continue clinging to a ghost, or I could begin the painful process of letting go. For the first time, I saw clearly that holding on to someone who doesn't want to stay is the slowest way to destroy yourself. That was the moment I knew. Claire's journey to find herself had to happen far away from me, and my journey now was to find out who I could be without her. The morning after Claire left, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my reflection staring back at me with hollow eyes, unshaven, shoulders slumped under the invisible weight pressing me down. For a long time, I didn't recognize the man looking back. He wasn't Jacob, the husband who had been planning anniversaries, dreaming of family trips, or worrying about mortgage payments. He was someone emptied, gutted, a shell left behind after love had walked out the door. And yet, as I stared at myself, I felt a flicker of something that hadn't been there in weeks. A choice. I could stay frozen in the wreckage of what had been, or I could start carving out what could be. Claire had chosen herself. Maybe it was time I chose myself too. I started small. The next day, I cleaned the house. It wasn't just about dusting shelves or vacuuming floors. It was about reclaiming the space, room by room, as mine. I picked up her forgotten sweater from the back of the couch and folded it into a box, alongside the mug she used to drink her morning tea and the half-empty bottles of her favorite lotion in the bathroom. Each item carried weight, and placing it in the box felt like lifting a stone off my chest. By the end of the afternoon, I had filled 2 boxes. They weren't labeled as hers or mine. They were simply what remained of a life that no longer existed. On the 3rd day, I reached out to an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. His name was Marcus, and we'd been close in college but drifted apart when marriage and careers pulled us in different directions. He didn't ask too many questions. He just invited me over for a beer. Sitting in his backyard that evening, talking about everything and nothing, I felt a crack in the isolation I had wrapped around myself. It wasn't healing yet, but it was connection, and that was enough to remind me that life still existed beyond the walls of my empty house. The hardest part was the nights. Every evening, I crawled into bed alone, and the silence screamed louder than any argument we had ever had. But instead of lying there in misery, I started a new ritual. I picked up the guitar I hadn't touched in years, my fingers stiff on the strings, the chords rough and clumsy. Still, with each night, the music came easier, and for the first time in a long time, I was creating something just for me. The sound filled the silence, and slowly, it began to feel less like a void and more like space for something new. Weeks turned into months, and though the pain didn't disappear, it shifted. It became less of a sharp wound and more of a scar forming, tender, but a reminder that I had survived. I began running in the mornings, the rhythm of my feet pounding against the pavement, syncing with the beat of my own determination. With each step, I shed the heaviness, the bitterness, the desperate need for answers I would never get. Claire had walked her path, and I was walking mine now, literally. The air on my face, the ache in my muscles, the clarity of dawn breaking around me became my therapy. One evening I received an email from Claire. It was brief, polite, almost clinical. She said she hoped I was doing well, and that she was finding her way, though the details were vague. For a long time, I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, wondering if I should respond. In the end, I didn't. Not out of spite, but because I realized I didn't need to. She was finding herself, and so was I, but our journeys no longer intersected. Deleting the message felt like closing the final chapter of a book I had read too many times. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. I was at a local coffee shop, notebook in hand, jotting down thoughts for a new project I had started at work. The barista, a young woman with bright eyes and an easy smile, handed me my order and made a joke about the weather. It was nothing more than a small exchange, but I laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. Walking back to my table, coffee warming my hand, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live again. And that's when it struck me. Losing Claire hadn't destroyed me. It had forced me to rebuild, to confront the parts of myself I had neglected in the shadow of a relationship. Her leaving had been the hardest thing I'd ever endured, but it had also set me free. Free to rediscover passions I had buried. Free to reconnect with people I had pushed aside. Free to become more than just a husband defined by someone else's presence. Looking back now, I see her words, "I need to find myself," with a clarity I couldn't before. At the time, they felt like a death sentence, a betrayal cloaked in self-discovery, but in truth, they were also a mirror. Claire needed to find herself, and in losing her, I needed to find myself too. The difference was, I found strength not by walking away from responsibility or love, but by embracing the painful, messy work of healing. I no longer dwell on the day she left, the sight of the suitcase by the door or the sound of her car pulling away. Those memories are scars, yes, but they no longer define me. Instead, I think about the mornings when I run under a rising sun, the evenings when I lose myself in music, the laughter I share with friends who remind me I'm not alone. I think about the man I see in the mirror now, Not broken, not hollow, but standing taller, stronger, more certain of who he is. So when I say I helped her find herself far away from me, I mean it not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Because in the distance she created, I found something too, my own life, my own strength, my own identity. And for the first time in a long time, I can say with certainty, I am enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.